Chapter 7 of The Art of Landscape Painting in Oil Color by Alfred East. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7 Trees. Trees are to the landscape what flowers are to the meadow. They decorate it. Who does not love trees? They are associated with us from the cradle to the grave. They mark the events and the incidents of history. They are the only living recipients of old-time stories. Generation after generation, they have listened to the same story of love. They have sheltered from the sun and rain, the king and the wayfarer alike. They are planted as mementos of great events. From the landing of Joseph of Arimathea to the coronation of our King, they have fulfilled this monumental quality. How many songs could we sing of trees? From the oak, the ash, and the rowan tree, in every language, in every land, they are intimately associated with the requirements of man. With what joy does the traveler see across the dreary desert of hot sand the oasis of palms, or the sailor see them rising in their verdant beauty on the lip of the horizon of the ocean. Shakespeare, Wordsworth, and 100 others speak of them. These writers have their favorites, as Balzac had, when he called the black poplar the noblest of trees. One could continue writing of their dignity, grace, and beauty. It is our business, however, to paint them. And how difficult, how subtle one finds them. Loving them as one does, knowing them so well, one feels how wonderful they are, here caressing and enfolding the homes of mankind, or there standing out against the sky on some wide upland. Strong, simple, dignified, and great. Let us treat them with the respect they deserve, and learn to know them so well that we can enter into their moods, whether it be when the rude winter has torn from them their foliage, or when the spring gives them new growth, or in the sumptuous splendor of their summer adornment. These peers of the nobility of nature are entitled to the first place in the consideration of the landscape painter. He loves them for their kindliness. He respects them for their stately dignity. The great landscapists have expressed this love of trees. Some have seen in them one quality and some another. All have attempted to realize the essential place and position in their art. I have suggested in the chapter on pencil drawing that you should draw all kinds of trees. By this means you will learn the peculiar characteristics of their growth under different conditions of soil and environment, and obtain greater knowledge for painting them. Having described how you should draw the contours and the shape of their branches and the shadows under their branches, their construction, the manner in which the trunk supports the branches, I must now attempt to speak of how they should be painted. The successful painting of trees against the sky, I think, is one of the most difficult problems of art. You have already designed your picture as to the quantity, the space, and shape of your trees. Now you have to consider their color and character. After you have blocked them in with the rest of your landscape, broadly and simply, as the whole lay in must be, you may at the next painting paint the sub-masses with the rest of your picture. Then next the smaller masses, and so on, something like a pile of coins, the first painting broad like a crown, the next over it like a florin, the next like a shilling, a sixpence, and a threepenny piece. That is how you paint a tree, each painting being a step nearer the realization of your aim, which must be to paint your tree in exact relation to the landscape in nature and on your canvas in exact relation to the rest of the picture. This is essential. The proper lighting of a tree is another word for modelling. Trees are rounded objects, and therefore must not be painted as flat tones. They are living objects, and must be painted so as to express their vitality. That brings me to the point of their edges, which come against the sky. In no part do they realize the sense of their vitality so much as where their moving leaves are marked against the sky. Here they are seen, and here their shape and action are most strongly felt. If we look at a photograph, the edges of the trees do not give you the feeling that the tree is a living thing. They are marked with hard precision against the light, like a solid building. And yet, at the same time, if we see them in nature, we hear the whisper of their leaves and know that they live and breathe. To express that is a greater truth than the camera can reveal, and a higher form of realism. Of course, the edges will vary according to the species of trees, and also according to the different conditions of effect. For instance, trees against the light appear different to those upon which the light is shining. An oak against the setting sun is a very different object to a birch which is bathed in the full glare of sunshine. Again, the speed of movement of the leaves against the sky gives one a different impression. The elm moves slowly, and so has a harder edge than the black poplars, which quiver in the least breath of air, and must be so painted as to suggest that characteristic quality. If the eye follows the movement of the leaves, they appear hard against the sky, but if you look at the tree and not at the individual leaf, you will recognize the truth of what I say. For example, look at the plane tree leaves which almost touch your window in your London home. You can mark their shape and colour, but look at the plane tree leaves on the opposite side of the street and you can only see the aggregate of their leaves. You know that the aggregate is composed of the same kind of leaves that are near you, and from your knowledge of that fact you wish to paint them, but you cannot. What of the near ones if the distant ones were so realized? You could not paint them more real than life. So remember this great truth, that there is as much beauty in the aggregate of details as in the details themselves. Let us watch the action of a leaf on a black poplar. It may first offer us in its movement a surface which reflects the sky. Then as it turns from us, the thin edge is only seen. Then it turns back again the reflective surface, and showing an angle by which its actual form and colour are revealed. These are phases, each affording us the reflective surface and the silhouette. This is but one leaf. If we bear in mind that all the leaves are moving more or less, you will come to the conclusion, if you think for a moment, that round the edge of the tree, where the leaves are against the sky, the edge must be made up of an aggregate of these movements. They are also turning at different intervals of time. For instance, while one is a silhouette, its neighbour may be at the angle of reflection, and another showing the thin line of its edge where all the intermediate movements are going on. Now you cannot paint actual movement in your picture, but if you paint the edge of a tree which combines the silhouette, the reflection, and the edge of the leaf, and other intermediate positions of the leaves, you will obtain the sense of their movement, which is such a desirable quality. The act of movement means life, and life interests us, for we are living beings ourselves. Dead things are abhorrent to us, and we put them out of sight. I remember an eminent painter saying to me, "I see foliage hard against the sky as an edged mass." I answered, "So do I, but I do not feel it so." You may depend upon it that if you think that the imitation of nature is the end of landscape painting, then I need not write another line, for no explanation is required, no directions needed. The painter is simply to sit down and paint what he sees. If he does so, he has probably pleased himself, but he has deceived others. Imitation is not art, and in the imitation of things one loses his own personality. He is a menial, not a creator, and if he is willing to give up his authority over the created things which were intended for his use, he cannot have any hope, and there is no faith in him. The slavery of imitation is terrible. If the painter cannot give us something he feels in nature that others have missed, why paint at all? There is no place for him. Look at a picture by Corot, Constable, or Turner, or any of the really great painters of landscape, and see how they suggested, in their different ways, this sense of movement which would be absolutely lost were we to imitate the actual and instantaneous fact of nature at one moment of observation. The real value of an instantaneous effect lies in its suggestion of other effects likely to precede or to follow. But the copying of things at the moment of arrested action is absurd. This is revealed by the camera. For instance, the position of a race horse in violent action seldom gives you the sense of movement. It is simply the photograph of the fact, but does not convey to one the sense of speed, which is, after all, the principal fact to be recorded. The edge of a tree, as I have said, is a succession of soft and hard accents. In your first painting you will have painted the edge of your tree with a tone of color half-way between the tone of the tree and sky, a little lighter than the tree and a little darker than the sky. Never mind if it is smeared over the exact shape you desire. When you paint your sky you can correct that. This half tone may be made of cobalt, rose madder, and white, with a little yellow ochre to qualify it. It should be of a pearly gray, the tone which Lord Leighton used to say was the subtone of nature. Now this subtone at the edge of your tree is waiting for those accents caused by the varied movements I have described. The silhouette is the definite and darkest touch, and the leaf upon which the fullest reflection is seen may be painted with the lightest light. Constable used almost pure white. And the subtone is the suggestion of the many being seen on edge. By far the greater proportion are seen in that position than in silhouette or the angle of reflection. Therefore this tone will express the greatest quantity. This may be after all but a clumsy explanation. You must study nature for yourselves. I simply put you on the track. Note how Corot painted the edges of his trees by the simplest possible means, and Turner by reducing the intensity of his color. Every painter has his own method, but all have the same end in view. Each must solve the difficult problem in his own way in seeking for the truth. Now let me speak of the bones of the tree. See that your trunks and branches are solid things, strong and hard by contrast. They, too, will help to suggest the movement of the leaves. Now comes the difficulty of the interstices, that is, the light shining through the trees. See that they do not upset your composition, for the next greatest accent in a landscape to the human figure is the light seen through a tree, for it is generally in proximity to the darkest shadow. The right angle of a branch and trunk in the center of your tree, with the sky beyond, forms a counterpoint in your picture, which, if not justly placed, will completely upset the balance of your composition. It is the most assertive thing in its whole appearance, and if it is necessary to include it to support the characteristic growth of your tree, be careful that it does not spoil your composition. You know that the color of the sky seen between the interstices of the tree is the same color as the wide expanse you have in your picture. So it is in nature. But paint it so, and immediately it will shout. You must lower the tone, or you will spoil the ensemble of the work by unduly attracting the eye to one particular spot, and so destroy the breadth of your effect. This is another example that the truth in nature is not always truth in art. You must reduce the tone of the sky as seen between the open spaces of your branches to give you the sense that it is actually of the same color as the general body of the sky, though, as I say, it is actually some degrees lower. One word more. The great advantage of painting your sky to suit your landscape, as described in another chapter, is that you can paint into the subtone, covering part and leaving part, and by so doing you advance that feeling of the movement of the leaves against the sky. You must, as I have said before, find out yourself, by careful study and observation, how this is to be done, bearing in mind that the greatest realism is the expression of the vitality and character of the thing painted. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of The Art of Landscape Painting in Oil Color by Alfred East. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Skies. If you make a practice of painting a sky every morning with the regularity that you take your bath, you will find at the end of 6 months that you know something of its variations. Perhaps the most convenient medium for this purpose is watercolor or pastel, but do them in oil by all means if you can, though the time lost in setting your palette robs you of the limited time you have at your disposal, for the clouds are changing every moment. Half an hour is sufficient, for I do not want you to make the practice a fag, or to take too much of the energy you must reserve for your ordinary work. Therefore, if you devote the half hour immediately before breakfast to this purpose, you will find it the most convenient time of the day. Be sure you draw your sky, and if you cannot finish it in the limited time, paint that part which is interesting. You can take a few notes in writing on your paper or your panel, as the case may be, of the characteristics you have not caught. They, with the bit of color, will be most useful. Apart from their use as studies, you will find that the practice will widen your knowledge of what is likely to happen under certain atmospheric conditions. Do not forget to date your sketches and note the hour and the direction and strength of the wind. If you paint a clear blue sky, you may make a study of its tone and gradation, its warmth or coldness. Or you may have one of thin, high cirrus, where the detached cloudlets float miles above you, interesting individually, and still more interesting in their aggregate. You may note how they are lit, and how far the light impinges upon their edges or influences the effect of their density, as shown by their opacity or otherwise. You may watch a wandering piece of cumulus moving at a lower altitude under the influence of a different current of air, and you will see how advantageous its form is in contrast with the mottled appearance of the cirrus. You will see the interesting phenomenon of one cloud passing under the shadow of another which has just intervened between it and the sun, and as it clears itself from its eclipse you will note the revelation of its modelling by the contour of its shadow. You may find one morning high masses of cumuli, such as we see after rain, moving slowly and majestically across the sky, towering up and up till their tops outvie the highest mountains. You will note their form and movement, their edges defined against the blue by a line which is felt rather than seen, giving them, with the shadow on the opposite side from the sun, their rounded forms. How nobly they sail across the sky, or on a hot day hang tranquilly in that ineffable blue which is so difficult to paint. You observe the distances between these masses. You see the perspective of one great cloud behind the other, how they slowly approach, till at length they form a great spectacle of white and soft grey. Through their interstices you get a glimpse of the blue, made many times more intense by its isolation. As the day grows to noon they pass along their celestial path, till in the evening they shelter themselves on the line of the extreme distance where the low sun lights them with its effulgent glory. Above the belt of long strata they lie, gradually changing from grey to gold, from gold to purple, as the sun's rays slant upwards from behind and gloom rests upon the purple hills. It is absorbing thus to watch a sky from dawn to sunset, say in September when the days are short enough to do so, and one may profitably devote a whole day to the study when the sky is particularly interesting. In the sketches I have given you facing page 90 you will see that they all represent the same scene, but in different aspects from dawn to sunset, and they illustrate not only what may be made of a commonplace subject by the selection of an effect, as I have stated elsewhere, but the enormous importance of the relation of the sky to the landscape. Do each sketch at one sitting, which must of necessity be short. You will find a great deal to learn that you had not anticipated. You will see shadows, reflections, and reflected lights, all which, carefully observed, build up the wonder of your sky, and if painted well, cannot fail to be interesting and beautiful. Let me give you a few hints about painting a sky. In the first place, you must, as I have just said, do it justice in one painting, but before making the attempt, prepare your canvas with a coat of white tempered with yellow ochre, which should be painted with crisp, firm touches, using very little medium, the touch firmer and stronger as your work extends from the horizon to the zenith. Beware of a dead flat surface. Do not brush it too much, as in painting at all times your touch should be confident. After the preliminary coat of paint is dry, You may scrape off any unpleasant projections left by your brush at the previous painting, and you will have a very agreeable surface to work upon. Then with white and yellow ochre you paint it exactly as you have done before, taking care to cross the brush marks, and after you have done this you paint your blue into the wet paint. You will discover that your blue will be a little stronger, since it will mix with the wet paint which forms the ground. I will now speak of painting a plain blue sky, since I have already spoken of clouds and their treatment. The blue must, of course, depend upon the colour in nature, and that which is in sympathy with your landscape. But, generally speaking, your palette is composed of the following: white, yellow ochre, cobalt or French ultramarine, viridian, and rose madder or Venetian red very much diluted with white. Now paint a touch composed of the first four. If you find it too intense a blue, add a little more white and yellow ochre and a mere touch of raw umber. If you find it too green, add more blue and white. Then, with different quantities of the slightest possible difference of colour, paint another touch by the side of the former. Then paint one with a distinctly red side, another to the yellow side, another to the blue side, and another to the green side. Then step back and see the general effect, which of course should be blue. At the horizon you will see no blue, or scarcely any. In its place use the slightest touch of raw umber or Venetian red and yellow ochre, according to the effect. You must be careful, for you will find the merest touch of blue is too much, and is most extraordinarily deceptive. Your extremely distant sky should be painted with small independent touches, edge to edge, with the slightest possible difference of colour, very much diluted with white, but still a difference which can be detected upon very close inspection. These should be placed at the horizon in a contrary way to the prismatic arrangement, and this method, instead of giving you a rhythm of colour, will give a feeling of vibration, because the tones will be very slightly contrasting or complementary, so that you will discover, although looking like a flat tone, it is really composed of many separated colours. This is one of the most difficult things to accomplish, and you will no doubt meet with many failures. You may get it too light or too dark at first, and too near in perspective. But never mind failure, try again, for when it is properly accomplished, you will have given the impression of great distance, and of moving air heated by the surface of the earth. You have now to join the colour of the horizon with the touches of blue you have already placed on your canvas higher up. The gradation must be very carefully done, still following the method of placing the colours side by side, increasing the area of the touch and the necessary slight alteration of colour, more blue and less of the warmer tints, until you join the blue, which is the general effect of the sky. Your warm touches are now more or less deepened with blue of slightly different shades, but of the same tone, until you reach the top of your canvas, where you can have large passages of plain colour. Now carefully look over the sky as a whole. You will probably see that your gradation is much more abrupt than in nature. That is to say, your sky changes more suddenly from the distance, where it partakes more or less of the colour of the extreme distance of the landscape, to the blue of the zenith. But that is as it should be, for if you take the relative space in Nature that you have taken in the picture between the horizon and the top of your canvas, you would find that the gradation in Nature was very small in that limited distance. By the quicker transition you obtain that sense of infinity which is a greater fact and of more importance than the actual truth. I spoke of the necessity of painting a sky at one effort. I did so because of the difficulty of patching blue after it is dry. The difference of colour in drying makes it a most troublesome thing to do. For instance, when the painting of your sky is dry, and you paint upon it exactly the same colours which match it when wet, the change in drying, slight as it is sufficient to reveal the patch, and there is imminent danger of losing the aerial feeling which is its predominant quality, and having to do the work all over again. But of all things avoid a flat sky. There is nothing so miserable in landscape painting as a mere piece of flat blue. No matter how beautiful and just the colour may be, if you cannot get away from the fact that it is paint and nothing but paint, if it fails to suggest to you the infinity of the sky, it is wrong. How little there is in the skies of Poussin or Claude, or in later times of Stanfield and others, to give the impression of this aerial quality. They are too often merely suggestive of a pattern of paint. How different are those of Turner, Cox and Constable, which, though differing in their mode of treatment, all show in common these qualities of infinity and distance. There are other means of painting a blue sky than that which I have described. I would not for one moment deny that, but I have described the manner by which I know from experience how these essential qualities may be obtained. In conclusion, I wish to draw attention to the tonal pitch of your sky. Since it is quite out of the question that you can get the exact tone of a sunlit landscape, it must be some degrees lower than Nature. It stands to reason that your sky must harmonize with Nature, and further, the composition and colour of your trees and grass must also be in sympathy with the forms as well as the colour of your sky. And as you cannot alter the composition of your trees to suit your sky, your best plan will be to paint the forms and colour of your sky to suit your trees. That is why I advise you, when laying in your first painting, simply to paint a preparatory ground for your sky, which is afterwards to receive its final painting. When your landscape is partly done, the preparatory painting at that stage will, of course, receive your careful attention. Don't be afraid of rubbing the foliage into the sky and the sky into the foliage at your first painting. You will have ample opportunity of getting the character of the edge when you are painting the sky at a later stage, and then the very greatest care must be exercised in the matter. It is useless to lay down any definite rules on cloud forms suitable for any particular picture, because there are so many factors which govern and qualify them. The sky must be felt upon all surfaces which are capable of reflecting it, not only in the pool of water, but from every blade of grass, from every flag by the waterside, from every leaf, roof and road. That is what may be understood as being in sympathy with the landscape. Always remember that it is the reflected light of the sky added to the local color of each object that makes up the general tone of the landscape. It is not only sunshine and distance that give it color, but an aggregate of a million little reflections. The essential truths of the sky are its immensity, its infinity, and its purity. Aim at securing these qualities, and you will have a fine sky. Let your landscape be in relation to your sky, and your sky to your landscape. In so doing, you will certainly have attained some of the high truths which go to make up a worthy picture. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The Art of Landscape Painting in Oil Color by Alfred East. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Grass. It would obviously be stupid, when painting a landscape, to paint every leaf and every blade of grass. We want the general character of the material, and that we cannot secure without careful observation of the factors of which it is composed. Go into a meadow on a sunny day. You can look at the grass facing the sun. You will notice that it is of the most brilliant green. The sun shines through the uppermost blades, penetrates others through the interstices of the first, and reaches so much of the remainder that practically every blade is deluged with rays that filter through the very substance of each leaf and compel it to transmit its hue to the eye. Then turn and look in the opposite direction from the sun. You will see that the grass, instead of being a bright green, is of a silvery green-gray. This is because you are standing at the angle of reflection of the majority of the blades, which catch the light of the sky as it shines upon them and not through them. Only here and there occasional blades show a rich green to qualify the general grayness. The aggregate of a field of grass is made up of infinite details of color, and its character is affected by countless little reflections, whether of the deep blue of the zenith or of a passing white cumulus cloud. Have you ever noticed, when a meadow is being mown and you happen to face the sun, the rich hue of the standing grass, through whose stems the yellow-green light penetrates in a brilliant glow? Examine the same grass when it is cut and lies in long swathes behind the mower. How gray it now appears! The infinity of leaves, through which the sun a while ago was freely shining, now reflects the summer sky at innumerable angles, and the result is the revelation of one of the most lovely combinations of color in nature. It is important to remember the difference in color of grass at dawn and sunset. The grass in the morning is grayer than in the evening, because in the former the light is reflected from myriads of dewdrops, whereas in the latter the reflections are from dry surfaces. A difficult thing to paint is grass in perspective. One knows, in looking across a wide meadow, there is a considerable difference in appearance between the grass at your feet and the grass in the extreme and intermediate distances. As the material is so uniform in color and texture, the difference is less perceptible than in the case of trees and other objects, which, by their diminution of size, add to the sense of distance, and are more easily placed in their proper perspective. But in a large flat grass field of even surface it is indeed difficult, and requires the greatest study and closest observation before you can realize the fact of its extent and its flatness. How many come to grief in this respect, and depend upon such aids as trees, cattle, or anything of a known size to assist them to realize its area. In many cases, if you took away these aids, you would have nothing left but a stretch of plain green, standing on edge, with the complete loss of the sense of its being a level plain. How is this to be avoided? The grass in the immediate foreground, which is near enough for you to see if you look closely, is composed of many shades of green, some blades transmitting the light, others reflecting the tint of the sky, and others presenting their own local color. You will also observe there are differences of color as well in each blade, some darker or lighter, some deeper in tone or less pronounced. You will see here and there withered stalks and 100 details which break up the mass. There are clover leaves, sorrel, dandelion, plantain, and many other weeds which, taken in the aggregate, build up the general color. In your immediate foreground it is possible to realize one or two of the most apparent of these, but a little further off it is difficult, and further off still it is impossible. The intermediate distance must not be so broken as the foreground, and the extreme may be flat. The contrast of this flat paint to the broken paint of the foreground will be another aid to perspective. Other things too will help you, as for instance a cloud shadow, a distant church, or a winding brook or river. But none of these incidental objects should lessen your effort to realize the character of grass. It is quite an easy matter to get the exact color of things close at hand. The representation of still life is comparatively easy, there being practically no room for dispute as to the local color of the objects. For instance, some beech leaves in a glass of water can be imitated, so far as color is concerned, by the merest tyro in art. But when the same leaves form part of a tree standing some distance away, the problem becomes a test of judgment and skill. Looking at the grass as a mass, you are conscious that in the immediate foreground of your picture you must realize the feeling of all its differences of color and texture, which is made up of 100 subtle differences of material, the predominant color, of course, being green. Now, as you see these broken shades of green in the foreground in nature, you must break up your pigment into the various shades of green without any attempt to realize individual blades of grass. Do not mix your colors on your palette. Take a little of each pure on your brush and place them on the canvas. If you find the effect a little too cold, you can correct it by a warmer tone in the next touch. If you find it too gray, you can lighten it by a little transparent oxide of chromium or cadmium, and so on. But put the touches down separately and firmly, and unite them at a subsequent painting. The distance will be painted with a flatter tone, and will be of a grayer quality of color. You will observe also that some portions of the grassy expanse are stronger in color, more yellow and blue will then be required, and more vigorous green. Or it may be that some withered stalks alter the local color, and you will want reds and yellows, with a dash of flake white, of course, to qualify the pigments. A bushy tuft occurs here, a smoother surface there, and so on. To represent the host of qualities which unite in the making of the whole field demands patient study of these and all such details. Grass grows up from the soil, but it does not follow that the paint should be put on in upright strokes all over the area occupied by it. Were it so, your picture would resemble green velvet. Some portions of your grass are indeed aggressively erect, but others lie prone. These latter and more level patches, if carefully painted, impart greater individuality to the prominences of the upstanding grass. The accent of flowers can be taken advantage of with profit, also the red sorrel stalk and the nettle. These touches will be suggested by the means already described in the course of the first painting, or they may be added afterwards. If you notice passages that are too obtrusive and broken, it is a simple matter to flatten them down. But, as I have said, it is necessary to have these flatter passages. The distance can be made flatter, but let this be in your first painting after the rubbing in, and the next painting will consist in emphasizing passages and introducing here and there groups of details hitherto omitted. And do not overlook the rule that when shadows overlay your grass, the same method of broken coloring will be revealed in the shadow as in the open light, except that the tone is lower, and that the shadow as such will bring its special tint to the general effect. If you do this successfully, you will be astonished to find how nearly you express the general feeling of nature. For painting grass I should use white, yellow ochre, French blue, No. 2 cadmium, transparent oxide of chromium, and rose madder, sometimes a warm gray of raw umber and white, a long-haired brush, and plenty of confidence and paint. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of The Art of Landscape Painting in Oil Color by Alfred East. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10, Reflections. If you have been to sea, you may have noticed that the color of the water was mainly due to the reflection of the sky. The motions of the wind and ocean currents throw the waves into many angles, which reflect portions of the sky at various lines of incidence. If you cross the channel, you observe a difference in the color of the water when you face the sun or turn away from it. You know the water itself is the same, but it has varied with the appearance of the sky. The sea, like the land, derives its tints from numerous causes. The clouds, in all their transformations from dawn to sundown, affect the result, and to their reflections must be added the mutual interaction of lights and shadows among the waves themselves. Have you watched the agitated surface of a rapid stream? It displays an immense variety of lights and darks, more baffling than anything else in natural phenomena. Its movement is so quick, the colors of the reflected objects are so diverse, as to render it almost impossible to portray its interlacing and intermingling forms. Only by the most persistent study, first in a series of drawings of a simple passage, and then of a more involved passage, can you attain thorough mastery of both facts and the method of treating them. Perhaps the simplest stage in the study would be an examination of the reflection of some individual object, that is, a light-colored pole standing by the edge of the water. It has, we will suppose, a background of dark green trees, which almost cover the area of its reflections. You will see the contortions of its shape produced by the swift alterations in the surface of the watery mirror. At the base of the reflection, the line of the reflected pole is broken into quivering fragments. This is accounted for by the interruption of other reflections at other angles. You will observe that the movement of the reflected forms are coincident with the movement of the water, and at the edge of the stream the object is more defined, and as it gets nearer the center it is broken up or confused by the more rapid movement. But supposing the stream was still, the reflection would be almost a replica of the object. But if you find it difficult to draw the reflection of the pole, your task is increased when you come to its background. You not only have to represent a light object against a dark space, but a confusion of many colors thrown across the moving surface. There are other conditions which lend attraction to the study of reflected trees in water. In the case of an absolutely still surface which reproduces the scene distinctly, the reflected object presents a different figure, owing to the angle of vision of the object itself varying from the angle of reflection. It is not necessary for my purpose to go very closely into the principle involved. My present aim is to encourage the student to observe, and he will reap ample reward in the many surprises of this fascinating research. From rough to smooth water you will find the reflection altered according to the motion of the water at the surface. Perhaps the most effective point, but not the most difficult to seize, is when the water is slightly agitated by the air, and the reflections are lengthened into long strips of color to the foreground. The charm of this particular effect is perhaps most striking on large sheets of inland water. The surface may be so agitated as to produce lengthy reflections of sky tints which create a more vivid feeling of liquidity than if the water were still. Take again the reflected glare of the sun upon water on a sultry day. The heat has dimmed the mountains with a soft haze, and the sleepy lake lies like an inert mass of molten metal. The very air seems thick with heat, and all about you is a sense of its throbbing pulsation. Nothing seems to move except by the disturbance of the heat waves. A fish leaps, and the broken surface of the water reflects the sunshine in an instantaneous flash. Or you may have seen some floating rushes. The capillary attraction pulls up the water till it presents a reflecting surface to the sun, and reveals an edge of intense brilliance which it would be impossible fully to realize with paint. Have you noticed also the sun at noon on a hot August day, how its heat fills the air with a quivering mirage, how everything that is seen within a certain distance from the earth's surface seems to be vibrating? You actually see the heat, and its peculiar effect upon the lower sky, which, practically speaking, is clear. You wish to give the sensation of it in your picture. Every sky which is clear and big, with a low landscape horizon, gives in a more or less marked manner this sensation along its edge. At the zenith it may be quite calm and pure, a vast expanse of perfectly placid blue, but by noon along the hot fields you observe the heat shimmering and vibrating with a growing effect upon the flat fields, until the figures of the harvesters in the distance, and the cattle and the horses, are distorted by a strange radiation. The sun's reflection is sometimes caught in looking from a height upon a river between the trunks of trees. The light cuts out the substance of the intervening darks, and in some places, where the trunk is slender, apparently divides it. This glare of intense sunshine cannot be entirely realized. As usual, a compromise must be made, and if that compromise gives you the feeling of the actual fact, then it is justified. I may say in passing that the white of the palette does not express light. Break it with yellow, not mix it, and you will find that it suggests a higher key, although in reality it is of a lower shade than the actual white pigment. Similarly, the juxtaposition of certain pigments, so broken that the predominant feeling of the colors is the same as that of a flat tone, may give one a sensation of vibration, although appearing in the general arrangement of color values as a flat tone. Roofs of houses, by reflection, may reach a higher pitch of light than anything else in the landscape, and make a most interesting feature, and one which probably conveys the idea of sunshine better than any other detail of your composition. The beauty of reflected color may contribute much to your design. I can recall the reflection of the sublime Fujiyama across the water in the Lake of Hara, ending amid the interstices of the amber rushes at my feet. Beyond the mirrored blue of the sky, the snow peak, and the mystic gray of the shore gleamed a strip of pale rose color. One would have supposed this to reflect the sky immediately above, but no, it reflected another part of the heavens. Innumerable wavelets, ruffled by a passing current of air, had caught up the tint of a rosy cloud and transferred it to a remoter part of the lake. The reflection from sunlit grass on the under parts of a white cow, combined with that of the sky on its back, is a puzzling thing to paint, but it is far worthier your brush than the exercise of painting the cow in the shadow of a foldyard, uncomplicated by reflected lights. I was once asked to criticize a picture of cows under an evening sky, and I made the comment that it was not painted from nature. "Why?" inquired the artist. "Because," I replied, "you show no reflections of the eastern sky upon the surfaces which would in nature throw them back to your eye." We admire the beauty of reflection in a crowded street on a wet afternoon. The lamps have just been lit, and they are repeated with many variations in the puddles. The pavement reflects the wayfarer, giving its own local color and accepting others. On a bright day there is an enormous amount of reflected light from the sky which subdues the color and at the same time raises the pitch of light, the result being the loss of that richness one sees when the sky is gray. To view the full brilliance of color in any country, you must see it under a gray sky. You have probably remarked the difference in this respect between England and the South. Not only is the landscape grayer by reason of the local color of the component parts of the landscape, but it becomes so in consequence of the more pronounced light. A scarlet dress in an English scene looks brilliant, but the same object, transferred to a street in sunlit Cairo, would melt into its surroundings. In Egypt the glare of the sun is so strong that the houses add to their native whiteness a blazing reflection which defies paint, and this circumstance drove many artists to darken the sky, a conventional device which only defeated its own end. The object which they failed to achieve by this means was to represent the all-pervading light and heat which lend so distinct a feature to Egyptian scenery. So again, the physical effect upon one's eyesight of reflected light in the desert or on an alpine snow slope imparts a sensation which endures in one's memory. But though that glow may be realized partially by words, its brilliance can be much less adequately conveyed by painting. Note the reflection of the grass upon the trunks of trees near the ground. By painting this reflection you will at once get rid of the hardness which most amateurs betray. Do what Corot did. Walk round your tree, examine it narrowly, and learn to know it thoroughly before attempting to paint it. Note that not only is the colour of the trunk altered by reflected light, but every leaf, while always in colour sympathy with the sky, reflects light and colour according to its surfaces. For example, leaves with an absorbent surface, as the elm, do not reflect the sky as brilliantly as those with a smoother surface. And always remember that the colour of a tree is built up by the aggregate of the colours of its leaves. You will have noticed how within the shadow of a whitewashed wall across a sunlit street there gleams the reflection of the shining road. The light is reflected and re-reflected again like an echo. Remark also that the depth of water is indicated by the character of the reflections on its surface. Shallow water reveals the colour of its bed within the reflection of dark objects. Note on a rainy day the 100 phenomena of the wet streets, and you will see things that will come to you as revelations. The other day I saw in a river a submerged boat. I perceived distinctly its ribs and seats. Without changing my position, when I half closed my eyes, I saw nothing but the reflection of the sky. Upon the same factor of sky reflection depends the just modelling of a tree and its branches, and you should not set out to reproduce foliage before you have conscientiously studied the action of reflected light. 1,000 things in nature are beautified by reflections, which give animation and vitality. Reflected light makes the edge of a stagnant pond sparkle like a necklace of diamonds. It touches the scythe which severs the dank grass. It illuminates the ferrule of the carter's whip until it glistens like the sceptre of a king. It vivifies your subject and gives a soul to your picture. It should always manifest its presence. It is easily forgotten in the studio, but not so readily when one faces nature. There is no excuse for the painter, let his scheme be ever so decorative, who neglects the aid of a quality which often adds to and can never detract from the dignity of his work. If I may so define it, it announces the sympathy and unity of nature. Kissing with golden light the meadow green, gilding the stream with heavenly alchemy. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of The Art of Landscape Painting in Oil Color by Alfred East. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Distance. The color of distant landscape varies in 1,000 ways, according to the conditions under which it is seen. In Italy, for instance, a distance may be supremely blue, while in England it may be a varied commingling of tender greys. In this country the distance often merges into the sky, so that it is impossible to see the line which marks the actual division. In Scotland, on a clear autumn evening, when looking towards the sun, the distant hills are often of a simple tone of deep purple, but with the low light of the setting sun shining upon them, every detail of the variegated cultivation, scraps of rock or patches of heather, etc., are revealed. We know how distant these objects are in nature, but how to realize that sense of distance when painted in this high key of colour is a most difficult problem. We know that certain objects in nature are at such and such a distance from us, and our knowledge of the fact prevents us from depending upon the sense of judgment by colour. We do a mental sum in miles instead of making a close study, as we should do, of the difference of colour values. The diminution of form is resorted to before we begin to think of the difference in colour. This arises from the fact that it is so easy to judge the size of a known object, such as a house or figure, from that which we almost unconsciously express our opinion. I say almost, since it is not always the case, for we frequently hear the exclamation from someone who gazes from a height, "How small the people look!" This is an example of the constant appeal to scale as a proof of distance. The road winding through a valley, a row of poplar trees, or distant houses are tangible facts. They diminish in form as they recede at the same rate under all atmospheric conditions. But what shall we say of colour, which is governed by conditions of atmosphere in its wonderful changes from dawn to sunset? Not for an hour is the colour of any given distance the same. Almost imperceptibly it changes in sympathy with the sky and vouchsafes fresh revelations of character as the general volume of light increases and wanes through the long summer day. Observe the shadow which started with a long line down the hillside, creeping on till it hides itself behind the brightening trees and throws itself like a blue-purple line across the winding road. The cottages, which were dark before, are now as white as marble patches on the sapphire background of the sky. The river, which wound below the hill in modest grey, now flashes back the burnished gold of midday, while the sun marches triumphantly on its course, each step adding a new beauty in place of each departing charm. The glamour of heat makes the distance magical. It vibrates and scintillates through and over all things, and gives mysterious changes to the scene we saw hours ago in the young light of the morning. It fills the landscape with a glistening flood of reflection. Every leaf in the foreground which holds its face upwards laughs back to the glory of the sunshine, and the far-sweeping distance throbs in its strange effulgence. There are no shadows visible now, except from the near objects, as the sun is high above us, and the whole of the distance is bathed in light. We are struck by the breadth and beauty of illumination, but to convey the sensation by our painted canvas is an end more easily desired than attained. One should notice the colour effect of this heat glamour in its multitudinous variations. The artist should absorb it into his memory, for it is infinitely more beautiful than we deemed possible. I know of no master of the old school who has attempted to conquer this problem. I know of few pictures in Europe which, since landscape painting became an independent art, have adequately expressed the wonder of it. Yet it is evident to the observant eye almost every summer day. It is perhaps one of its most familiar effects. It is known to all, yet painted by few. I would not counsel any student of landscape painting to attempt it at first, particularly in its influence on distant colour, until he has overcome the less formidable effects. Let him select an effect when the shadows reveal the modelling of the trees, or lay their grey veils over hill or road. he will find it hard enough in all conscience without essaying the most difficult. Distance under any conditions is sufficiently baffling. It is a subject that demands, yet repays, the most diligent study. A beautiful distance which leads the eye through and beyond the paint of a landscape is one of the charms which unfailingly appeals to the lover of nature and art. I will endeavour to furnish you with a few hints that may be profitable and instructive. Let us imagine a landscape comprising trees and a grass foreground, across which a path winds over the ridge of a field in the middle distance. Stretching among its undulations, a river skirts the sloping field, and is then hidden by intercepting trees or the elevation of its bank. At the back the grass fields and ploughed lands recede towards the skyline. We know that grass afar off is green. It is composed of the same material as the grass at our feet, and the natural inclination is, of course, to judge the colour by our knowledge of this familiar fact. But let us take a test case. Here is a hillock close to our feet. If we lower our face so as to bring the grass of the foreground on a level with the grasslands of the distance, we find our conception of the colour of the latter completely upset. It is a grey and not green, and of such a quality as to suggest the distance between them. Between the two colours thus juxtaposed lie all the variations of tone that intervene between the nearest material and the more remote. The nearest grass is the positive green of its local colour. The colour of the distant grass may be obtained by white, cobalt, yellow ochre, a touch of rose madder and raw umber, and when seen through a haze, an effect so difficult to paint, you will find that yellow ochre, cobalt, and the least suspicion of rose madder, all suppressed of course with white, will approach the tone. But only experience can tell the exact proportions of each colour suitable for the purpose. The lower sky must be painted at the same time as the extreme distance. You may have observed that these are nearly the same, the alteration of texture and treatment being all that is necessary to suggest the difference. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of The Art of Landscape Painting in Oil Color by Alfred East. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Selection and Treatment of a Subject. The raison d'etre of the existence of the landscape painter is that he can discern and reveal to us beauties in nature which cannot be revealed by the sister arts. He delights in his expression of nature and trusts that he may interest others. But if he is a true artist, he is not over anxious on that score. Great work is always in advance of public appreciation. It has been so in the past and is likely to be so in the future. The selection of a subject is a problem which faces the painter at the outset of his work. No matter how beautifully a picture may be executed, if its subject has been filched from the domain of literature or music, it is, from the highest standpoint, a failure. When you go to nature to select a subject, remember there are others, employing other means of expression, who also wish to tell the story which she inspires. Bearing this in mind, you may be able to find some subject which can only be expressed suitably by the painter, and with that conviction you should have confidence sufficient to carry you through to a successful issue. Therefore, if you have a method of expression different from, though not necessarily better than, that of the poet or musician, you must learn in what that difference consists, lest you all unwittingly stray into their domains. I do not say you should not paint a literary subject, but you should not paint it merely to express its literary aspect. You can, or ought to be able to, add to the literary illusion new meanings conveyed by the charm of form or color. Accepting what I have said, it is your privilege to take what you want from Nature. You are free to make selection from the material before you. But be sure your selection is such as can be best expressed by painting. Therein lies your responsibility. In the matter of selection, too, there arises the problem of the possible overcrowding of a picture. The artist feels he cannot paint everything, and the question is, what shall he paint? He is forced to make his selection from subjects in his district, and as he descends to details, the task of selection becomes more and more difficult. Half a dozen artists may paint the same subject, under the same conditions, and yet how different are the results. That is because one has been influenced by one thing which specially appealed to him, and the others have been each affected by other qualities. Every result will be more or less like Nature, but all will differ from each other. Now imagine these 6 artists painting the same subject, but each selecting for himself the particular effect under which he would paint it. The difference then would be very much more marked. One might think that the early morning effect best suited the simplicity of the landscape, another the light of noon, while a third might feel that the evening glow of color gave the best effect to the material. I have painted 8 sketches of the same subject under different effects to illustrate my meaning. See facing page 90. These sketches will probably bring home to you the truth of the responsibility of the artist in the treatment of his subject and the particular effect under which he elects to paint it. The selection is left to his discretion entirely. It is for him to say which of the effects from dawn to sunset he will choose. If I ventured to give him any advice at all, it is simply to say, paint the effect which best harmonizes with the landscape, that which most enhances the beauty of its leading characteristics. In this selection he will show what stuff he is made of, for, as I have said, he is a free agent, and Nature offers such an ample choice that there is no excuse for failure. The artist who loses his opportunity may attempt to shelter himself behind the assertion that his picture is like Nature. There are many bad pictures very like Nature in some respects, but such a claim is inadequate, for the painter may have represented Nature in her worst mood and under the most unsuitable conditions. It is absolutely necessary that the subject for painting should be selected with this consideration fully borne in mind. You cannot shirk your responsibility, so do not rush to a decision, lest you have to beat an ignominious retreat. The first aim, then, in the selection of a subject for painting must be that your subject conforms to the limitations and conditions of your art, and it should be such an one as cannot be better expressed by any other branch of art. Secondly, see that you paint your subject under conditions that will best bring out its special characteristics. Next, we must consider what are the qualities essential to support its characteristics and what are non-essential. Nature is so prolific in her offerings that selection becomes an artistic quality of the first order. It is astonishing what one can see in nature if one is predisposed to look for it. Some painters see nature almost monochromatic. Others see it polychromatic. One sees the immensity of its details and analyzes its component parts. One may look for the big facts and another for the little ones. One is moved by the simplicity of nature and another by its complexity. Perhaps the highest and rarest gift is the power to see the big things of nature, the real essentials, those which reveal and stamp upon the mind of man those fundamental qualities by which it is expressed. If an artist can so discipline himself when painting from nature as to accept only those things which are great and characteristic, and paint them in their true relation to each other, that is, in their just values, then his pictures will possess that quality so difficult of definition which we call style. Let me caution you never to be tempted to paint a landscape because of some accidental prettiness in it. Such an impulse is always dangerous and sometimes fatal to the success of your work. I have known a person to paint a 6-foot picture in order to include a distant mill or church. If he had reflected for a moment that this church or mill covered exactly 1 square inch within 28 superficial feet, he might have seen at once the foolish waste of his effort. Do not be tempted by anything, no matter how charming it may be in itself. Remember, it can only be beautiful for your purpose in so far as it assists your general scheme. I have said that you should not try to embody in painting an idea that may better be expressed by music or literature. But you may, of course, go to nature with a preconception, such as a sentiment of dignity or repose. This sentiment may have been begotten in your mind by some suggestion in poetry or music, a suggestion which seemed to you not fully realized by them, and which you felt you could better express in painting. With such an idea in your mind, you may go to nature for the materials to realize it. You will not find these materials in conjunction, and you may not find them close at hand, but knowing what you want, you will be able, with patience, to bring them together so that they appeal to the spectator with the convincing truth that they were actually in conjunction in nature. This is a high quality in the art of landscape painting. The artist is born, not made, but to attain such success he must go through the toil of study until he is so confident that he knows enough of nature to transpose her forms, if necessary, to his requirements. May I, you ask, take a tree from this place because its form and outline suit my composition, and put it here in place of a tree in nature that is not so suitable to my purpose? Yes, you may. There is no law forbidding. You have as much right to replant your tree as the peasant who planted it there originally. Only see to it that your transferred tree appears as if it naturally grew there. Let it be lighted at the same angle as the one it displaced. Let its shadow have the correct form and extent. Let the aerial perspective be identical with other trees in the same pictorial plane. Let the painting of it be as confident as the rest of your landscape. Then you will probably elicit the remarks from those who see the picture, "What a charming place!" "What a delightful scheme!" etc. People will often visit a spot where some famous landscape has been painted. They see that the material is there and that the picture gives one a true impression of the place, but there is very little like the actual arrangement of those materials. I have been sorry for some who, having taken a long journey, discover that the charm of the picture they had admired rested not altogether in the natural beauty of the scene, but in the art of the man who has transmuted the scattered material into one precious unity. This is the function of art, to endow man with an authority to use nature. Though the selection of a subject is one that requires discrimination, a fine work of art is not altogether dependent upon this subject, no matter how beautiful that may be, but rather upon its treatment. For example, we may see pictures of Venice which realize the facts of that beautiful city to the fullest, but they cannot for one moment be compared to the wonderful glamour of one of Turner's works. He has treated his subject so that it exceeds in beauty the most wonderful effects in nature. In his treatment of the facts of nature, they become transmuted, and that which is apparently poor and sordid becomes glorified and grand. No doubt the treatment of a subject depends upon one's temperamental attitude towards nature. That is well, for as I have said before, it is this personal quality that makes the different expressions of art so interesting and stamps upon them individual character and distinction. In the 8 sketches which illustrate this chapter, you will see that I have represented the same subject, a very simple one, in its varying effects from dawn to sunset. There is little or no difference in the arrangements of the trees and fields, the bridge and water, yet how great the contrast between number 1 and number 8. These sketches give you suggestions of the possibilities by which any subject can be painted in different ways. But had I selected a finer subject, the result would probably have been still more interesting. If the illustrations show you the outward form of nature under different conditions, which reveal the subtleties of morning and evening, with but little material by which to express their peculiar glamour, how much more beautiful would the dawn or sunset be when associated with really fine material, which would assist the peculiar qualities one associates with these fascinating moments. Note, for instance, the real background of Turner's Sun of Venice, Going to Sea. Revealed by the camera, one sees a row of buildings, interesting enough as ordinary dwelling places, with all the hard details of their construction. But with Turner, they are almost lost by the glamour and mystery of the morning, wherein 1,000 thoughts and associations of ideas crowd into our minds, which are absent in the photograph. The glamour was not created by the accurate and faithful delineation of the material, but by that magic of treatment which raises it to the splendor of a work of art. I am fully aware that my readers cannot all be Turners, but they may cultivate that insight of nature that can see possibilities of splendor in the ordinary landscape around them. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of The Art of Landscape Painting in Oil Color by Alfred East. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, Painting from Nature. A great deal of discussion has taken place as to the advantage or otherwise, of painting large pictures direct from nature. A school, calling itself the Plein Air School, made this principle their party cry. There may have been a reason for this, as landscape painting had become, to a large extent, a mere formula, a combination of recipes handed down by the old conventionalists, and had the odor of the studio. It wanted a breath of fresh air to revivify it. The Plein Air School did, in some respects, accomplish this, although its methods may have been pushed beyond legitimate limits. But all the faults combined of the new school were better than the artificial procedure of the older method. Painters awoke from their lethargy and felt that in the freedom and individuality of the example of Constable and others a new era had arrived, in which it was possible for art to make advances parallel with progress in other departments of human achievements, though it was years before the more natural attitude received its due recognition. Artists now posed their peasants in the open air and painted the effect of sunlight upon them from immediate observation, and studied with direct vision the subtle effect of light, shade, and color. Landscape painters took out their large canvases to Nature and painted the subject before them on the spot. The difficulties were not lessened, but the question arose, was it possible by this method to secure the freshness of Nature, the sense of its atmosphere and illumination? Undoubtedly it was, but difficulties beset the path of these men, which have still to be faced and overcome. The great danger was of following the changing light instead of painting an effect of the moment. It frequently happened that in the large landscapes so painted the effects of sunshine were crossed, that is, that instead of being positive as in a sketch, they were distributed or expressed with more or less hesitation and lack of definite purpose. It was difficult to avoid falling into this error. The temptation was always present to paint the thing one saw at the moment, forgetting that 5 minutes later the sun would be blazing upon a surface which was now in shadow. If the effect of light on that portion of the picture were true to nature, by the time you had painted it, the effect in another portion of the picture would be false. The only way out of the difficulty was to paint for a short time every day while the effect was on, at the same time correcting the values and having the courage to retain them while finishing the picture. Of course, this plan would not ensure that you had the color scheme before you long enough to get a satisfactory result, but you would have your sketches to keep you right in respect to the large masses of your subject. If you ventured in the spring to paint a picture of apple blossom, probably you would find that the blossoms would have faded before the picture was done. I remember a painter who was a determined sticker to nature, starting a picture of apple blossom. He commenced his picture well ahead of the full development of the flowers, and with dogged determination made up his mind to go for it. He painted the blossom with painstaking efforts to realize it according to his ideal of perfection. Conscientiously he altered his picture with the changing aspects of nature, till at length the blossom vanished, the full-grown leaves appeared, and the young fruit was developed. When I saw the picture finished, it was called Gathering Apples. Or you might paint a subject that mainly depends upon its color. The rain descends, your large canvas is brought indoors, and by the time the weather has again become suitable, the whole of your effect has changed. It no longer offers the attractive combination of color which had induced you to paint it. Such are the difficulties one has to contend with in painting a large picture from nature. The difficulties, of course, diminish with the reduction of size of your canvas, since you have a greater command over the smaller area. If, therefore, you care to make the experiment of painting, say, a 5 or 6 foot picture direct from nature, you should, in the first place, make sure that the subject is not liable to rapid change. When you have discovered one that excites your enthusiasm, start by drawing an outline of your composition in charcoal, using as big a stick as possible. When you have done so satisfactorily, redraw over the lines with a lead pencil, then brush off the charcoal. But before doing so, it is as well either to rub your canvas down with pumice stone, or wash it with benzene to take off the greasiness of its surface before starting. That had better be done before you draw upon it. Now, since you have made your drawing, you can begin to paint. Set your palette generously. Don't, for heaven's sake, use a starved palette. Be prepared, if I may so express it, to waste all your color sooner than get a thin picture. Have your dipper big enough to take a large brush. Assuming then that you have set your palette with plenty of white, and the colors arranged as I have already described (see Chapter 3, Sketching from Nature), start to paint with confidence. Work freely from your shoulder with your large canvas upright and at such a height that you can work standing. That is, the center of the canvas should be a little lower than the palette hand, so that each part can be reached without fatigue. Paint in your large masses broadly, which you will observe in nature the more readily by half closing your eyes, but in their absolutely correct values and right relation to each other. Look for the contours of your lights and darks, then paint fearlessly and frankly. Do not at this stage worry about details, but look for the large things, remembering that the shape of one mass forms the shape of the mass of another. For instance, the outline of the trees describes the form of the light of your sky. Your subject must be reduced to its simplest proportions. Broadly speaking, it will comprise but 2 or 3 salient qualities. The darkest are your trees, the lightest your sky, with the grass forming a middle tint. Of course, this remark is merely a general one. These masses may and will vary according to the subject you are painting. But what I insist upon is that in the preliminary stage of your picture you paint the effect that you wish to secure, and as you cannot begin with details, the only plan is to block in the masses with a big brush while the effect is on. This should be done at a single painting if possible. Do not trouble about anything else. If, for example, you cannot paint the whole of the foreground, paint a passage of it so that it records the exact color in relation to the trees above it, and proceed in like manner with the sky. It is essential that all these things which are chiefly affected by the rapidly changing effect must receive your attention at the moment. A splash of color of the right tone is better at this stage than the careful drawing of the contour of a branch, for the one effect is transitory and the other will wait. Before you commence a large picture, I should strongly advise you to study your subject for some days and to see it under various aspects and conditions. It is not pleasant to discover, when the picture is half finished, that it has not been painted under the best effect. Such study is not lost time, for apart from your definite purpose there is the knowledge you gain of nature. You become so intimately acquainted with your subject that you know how it is put together and of what it is composed. You should also make sketches in color under the same conditions you elect to paint your picture, and also make pencil drawings to familiarize you with its forms. Do not think such energy is misspent. Curb your impatience to get at your picture. I know it requires an effort to do so, but believe me, the wider your knowledge of your subject prior to painting it on your canvas, the greater are the probabilities of success. I would almost go so far as to say that you should know it well enough to paint it from memory, but that would obviously be traveling beyond the range of painting direct from nature. The advantage of painting from nature is that you gain confidence. Confidence comes of knowledge, and that means spontaneity, one of the qualities which can be worth nothing if it is not obtained by intense consciousness. You have now, we will suppose, your 6-footer covered. Never mind how roughly or how broadly, as long as you have correctly laid in your values. I do not know if it is necessary to explain what I mean by values. As we use the term in art, it means the truth of one tone in relation to another as compared with nature. For example, if I pitch my picture as near as I can to the pitch of nature, and paint one passage exactly of the same intensity or tone as the same passage in nature, I have struck the key, as it were, in which my tune must be played. I can, of course, transpose it by striking a new key. I can paint the passage I speak of in a lower tone, but all the other tones in the picture must be lowered in the same relation to one another as they are in nature. For instance, I call the pitch of nature A. Say that in nature it is glowing sunlight, and that it is impossible for any pigment to reach so high a key of color. I am forced to lower my key to F. In nature all colors are in relation to A, and in my picture, in which the A has been reduced to F, all my tones must of course be in relation to F. If there is 40% difference between the light and shade in nature, there must be 40% difference between the light and shade of my picture, no matter what the pitch of my picture may be. At this moment do not concern yourself with finish. You have meanwhile presented your subject in its simplest proportions. If it has been expressed in a high key, and I should always advise your doing so, the various masses of color should be in exact relation, and the resulting harmony gives the quality of tone. Step back 50 or 60 paces from your canvas, and you will be pleasantly surprised to find, if these conditions which I insist on be observed, how like nature it is, for the distance in diminishing its size has made you unaware of the absence of details. Your picture should now wait till it is dry. You have, I hope, painted it with a generous brush, and very little, if any, medium. You have put on the paint with due regard to the texture of the material before you, and in order to prevent cracking, two courses are open to you. Either follow the method as described, or continue your picture while it is wet, which is the more difficult to do. The danger of cracking arises generally from the superimposition of fresh color upon a tacky or half-dried surface, more particularly in the case of a fast-drying paint over a slow one. The fault of cracking is not caused by the inferiority of paint or of medium, but by carelessness or indifference in the actual process of painting. The safest way when painting a large picture from nature is to let it dry thoroughly after you have finished the laying in, and see that it is thoroughly dry before you begin to work upon it again. Flake white dries in a few days, but as it dries from the surface it may mislead you. Although it appears to be quite dry, you will find that it is only superficially so, and is not solid underneath the skin. On the other hand, if you use zinc white, you know that if it is dry on the surface, it is solid underneath. The advantage of flake white is that it works more freely and is more elastic than zinc, although it yellows more quickly by time, while zinc white, when quite hard, has less elasticity, and its brittle quality lays it open to some objections. I use the new flake white, which I think has some of the good qualities of both without their drawbacks. If you have used this white, which dries from the bottom, you can, where necessary, scrape off any obtruding brush marks that have been left in the excitement of making the ébauche or first rub-in. If you use the ordinary flake white, which dries from the top, you must be careful in scraping, lest you make an ugly scar, which will afterwards be difficult to disguise. A cuttlefish bone is safer to employ than a scraper, since it grinds down the surface evenly. You must now oil out your picture with a little poppy oil, rubbing it well in and wiping off all that is superfluous. Then, with as big a brush as possible, you may recommence the correction of your masses. In this stage of your picture, keep it well under your command. Do not, under any consideration, attempt to finish it or any part or portion of it. Still, direct your chief attention to the ensemble and disregard details. Keep the whole thing as simple and as fresh and spontaneous as possible. Do not be afraid and do not hurry, and if your progress is apparently slow, never mind. You have made a real advance. A bad work is more often the result of hasty and ill-considered finish than of defective skill. Continue to paint thoughtfully, closely observing the essentials, the big facts of the truth of light and shade, of the relation of color to color, of contour to contour, modeling the branches of your trees, painting with broken color your foreground of grass with plenty of paint, so treating it that the brush marks will suggest the material. Always remember that each touch must have a meaning, some useful purpose to serve towards your desired end. As you paint, you also draw. The brush must develop the truth of form as well as of color. You are at this stage building up, as it were, the various surfaces for the reception of a final finish, and that will evolve itself without effort. Your picture will finish itself, for finish is simply the climax of self-criticisms and of careful balancing of effects and relations in comparison with nature. The treatment of nature in art is greatly a matter of the personal temperament of the painter. If an artist is attracted by the small things in nature, which are no doubt in themselves very beautiful, he will seek to reproduce them, and the result will, in the estimation of those who are in the habit of looking for little things, be very satisfactory and highly finished. But if these details are of no service in the expression of the large essential verities, then they are worse than useless. Aim at the great things, which include the details, making them subordinate as in nature, and placing them in due relation to the whole. If, on the other hand, you concern yourself with petty, though possibly charming, trivialities, they may worry and fret you because they hinder your appreciation of what is great. In correcting the surfaces where the brush marks are not consistent with the material represented, you must bear in mind that there is a perspective of texture. For instance, the extreme distance in the sky and landscape must not show the coarse texture of the foreground. The remote sky always gives the feeling of having a fine surface, which changes as it rises to the zenith. That is my impression, and I paint it so. The same principle holds good in the landscape itself. I feel the texture of the distance to be smoother than the foreground, and the difference expressed on the canvas increases the sense of aerial perspective. You will, of course, have a knowledge of the elementary rules of linear perspective, but the perspective of the landscape painter is not so much concerned with actual lines as with imaginary ones. He must bear in mind that the land is more or less flat, and not an upright diagram with the diminishing objects as the only proof of distance. The one great, strong line in nature is that which is felt rather than seen, upon which the mountains base themselves, and the undulations of the fields appear to follow. Upon this imaginary line everything rests, and it must be felt in any landscape that aspires to strength and certainty. The landscape painter must carefully study the influence of atmosphere upon the lessened dimensions of remoter objects, and remember that his tone values must be just, and this is intimately associated with the truth of aerial perspective. For instance, if a yellow tree appears on the same plane as a green one in an autumn landscape, it will be easy enough to portray them in their right size in relation to your foreground. But a difficulty may arise when you try to paint them both in the same atmospheric plane. It stands to reason that if an equal breadth of air intervenes between you and both trees, you have a color problem to deal with now, for it is essential that they appear, by reason of color as well as size, to be at the same distance from the observer. The lesson to bear in mind is that your aerial perspective must always be consistent with your linear perspective. Remote objects occasion difficulties, no doubt, but do not try to make them recede by diluting your foreground color by the addition of white. You cannot reach the result by such means. You must have a different set of pigments. The strong hues of your foreground, broken as in nature into 100 details, may be composed of cadmium of 3 grades of strength, of rose madder and white, with burnt sienna broken with white and transparent emerald oxide of chromium and transparent golden ochre. All these are broken together on your picture (see Chapter 3, Sketching from Nature), not mixed on your palette. But for the extreme distance your color should be mixed on your palette. For the intermediate distance you use paint not so flat as in the extreme distance, but not so broken as in your foreground. You have now, with plenty of paint and very little medium, practically repainted your picture. You have gone over most of the surface, except perhaps the shadows, which should not be thickly painted. You have modeled your trees, painted the middle distance, prepared the foreground with broken color, and above all, you have retained the original freshness of your effect, that first impression which imparted vitality to the subject. Now let me speak of the sky. It is as you left it in your first painting, merely a ground of white toned with yellow ochre. You will probably have seen many cloud forms pass during your work up to this point, and you know in your mind which will best harmonize with your composition. But still, it is better to watch when your effect comes on, so that you may note the particular color of the sky in relation to the trees, and in the same relation of color paint it in your picture. But one moment the form of the clouds that you perceive yonder may or not suit your scheme. You will be fortunate indeed if they harmonize absolutely. No matter how beautiful your clouds may be, if they do not suit the contours of your picture, you must avoid them, and accept only such as support and complete it, and are consistent with the character of the day. You must paint the sky again with the same tint as you used previously, a little warmer at the horizon and cooler above. Then mix the blue on your palette rather more strongly than is really needed, for the reason which I have already explained. You are now ready. You watch for your effect, which is coming on. You know it occurs at the moment of impact of that shadow upon the mass of trees which you have noted before. It is the supreme crisis when everything, as it were, will sing in tune. The clouds roll majestically forward and reveal the very form you desire. You are, of course, standing at your easel. No man ever painted a great sky sitting. You hold your breath in the excitement of the moment. You know what it means to your work. But do not hesitate. Do not flinch. Take up the blue in your brush and draw the sky which will give the edge of the clouds. Watch with attention the exquisite gradation of tone where it shows itself above the cloud to the top of your picture, to where it touches your extreme distance. The form and color gradation of a good sky will convey a sense of perspective as truly as the landscape below. You have now secured the tone and form of sky which is in sympathy with the other parts of your picture. You have painted in your blue, so little after all, but with a risk out of all proportion to its area. Your clouds may now be modeled with more deliberation, painting them with gray on the undersides, a gray composed of rose madder, cobalt, and yellow ochre. If the painting be properly prepared, the sky should be finished at one painting, though this purpose must necessarily be governed by size and other obvious circumstances. But what I want you to do now, and what is at this point of more importance, is to paint the sky into the edge of the trees. You will remember how in another chapter I discussed the method of dealing with this borderland of sky and foliage. Your picture having been brought to this point, you begin to feel you are within measurable distance of the end. Here I suggest that, if the conditions of nature are favorable, and there is no probability of a change in your subject, you should give the canvas a rest in order to let it dry. Again, bear in mind that you cannot patch blue. If you have failed in the sky, the better plan is to take it all off to the under layer with an ivory palette knife and begin afresh. So few artists paint a blue sky well because they try to patch up the blue. It is difficult to paint a white cloud on a blue sky. It will always be a patch. Of course, after many years of experience, you may be able to venture on some things which it would have been insane to attempt at an earlier stage, and this of adding blue to blue is one. Your picture is dry. You have oiled it out and taken it to nature again. You may have thought the time consumed for the preliminary studies was wasted, but believe me, it is by these studies that you gain the knowledge and confidence which enable you to reach a successful issue. Suppose it had commenced to rain, and continued raining, or that the atmosphere had remained gray for some considerable time, and at the end of this period the weather cleared only to reveal the fact that the trees and grass had completely changed their color. What then? As I have said before, your studies would be of the greatest value as reference. Here you find the benefit of the policy of making careful sketches and studies before commencing your picture. But if you are fortunate enough to have a continuation of suitable weather, you will have the opportunity of comparing the component parts of your picture with each other and nature during the time the effect is maintained. You now watch keenly for the subtle and more indefinite passages of color, such as the reflected or re-reflected lights which give it quality. As style depends mainly on the dignity of your composition, so quality depends upon the realization of the more indefinite variations which make up the masses. You now select from nature just those things that will sustain the character of your material. Your trees cannot show every leaf, although there are those who have thought otherwise, like the old Dutch landscape painters. They have come to grief. You must realize what is infinitely finer, the portrayal of foliage so as to indicate aggregation of leaves in the suggestion of the mass. Your painting must give the sensation that the masses of foliage are made up of multitudes of leaves, though they are not separately indicated. A house in the middle distance you know is built of bricks, but you would not for one moment think of depicting the individual courses. You would treat the wall as a tone of color, and let that suggest the material. Or take another case. Under the trees some cows are resting, and the sunshine dapples over them a pattern of light and shade. You know full well that the red and white and the light and shadow of their hides are composed of multitudes of fine hairs, but you do not dream of attempting the task of painting them. At the same time, you should not paint the cattle as you would a door, with flat paint that would reveal nothing of the truth of the material it is intended to represent. So with trees and grass. Our knowledge informs us that the grass field on the distant hillside is green, but hold up a few blades of the same material at arm's length for comparison, and you will find that the apparent distant green is not green at all, because of the effect of the intervening atmosphere. You have to paint it so as to render the same impression as that of nature, and to convince the spectator that though you paint it a yellow or blue-gray, it is identical in color with the meadow at your feet. Many illustrations could be added, if necessary, to emphasize this principle, but I have said enough, I think, to convince you of the absurd notion, promulgated by some, that the closer imitation of nature in detail shows greater knowledge. It is not so. The subtler knowledge of nature is evinced by the artist who knows nature so well that he can adapt it to his own purpose. It is so in all things. The writer and the musician proceed on the same method. It would be absurd to say that the mere reproduction of natural sounds is music, or that a faithful description of a locality in a guidebook is literature. I remember an exhibition of landscapes which were submitted in competition for a prize. Although the prize was offered for a landscape, it was given to the painter of a careful study of rushes on a river bank. No doubt it was a faithful study, and the rushes were excellently painted, but it was not a landscape, and all those who had painted landscapes were naturally surprised at the award. Its supposed merit consisted in the most servile imitation of nature, which excluded every particle of the personality of the painter, and only the abject ignorance of the character of things was revealed. It will be interesting to follow the career of that young artist if he paints his landscapes in that spirit. He would have done better had he learnt more of the possibilities of the growth of his rushes, so that he could include them in any form when it was necessary. Your picture may be said to be finished when it would be superfluous to add another touch to it, and when it rings in perfect harmony and rhythm of line and mass of tone and color. The beauty and dignity of your composition, your scheme of color, and all the personal and individual expression of your painting should be full of that great quality which must be the dominant note of your picture, and that is the expression of the vital force and the convincing truth of nature. I have already pointed out the advantage of making studies direct from nature as aids to painting. How valuable then are studies of color effects to those who paint their most important pictures in the studio, and who must of necessity depend upon them and upon their recollection and impressions for the truth they wish to convey. So much has been said in support of painting direct from nature, and there are so many advantages accruing from the practice, that I should advise the student at present to confine himself to that particular method. But it is nevertheless true that some of the greatest landscapes in the world have not been painted on the spot, and it is also true that the artists who painted them only achieved success by passing through the curriculum and discipline I have attempted to describe. I feel sure that Turner would not have painted the pictures which stand highest in our esteem had he not thoroughly acquainted himself with nature by his constant practice of sketching. For instance, we recognize his greatness in The Shipwreck, or Crossing the Brook, or The Bay of Baiae. In the first picture the artist accurately reveals the power and majesty of the sea, and in the second and third the wide outlook of the country lying in the vibrating light and heat of summer, conveying the most beautiful and subtle effects of broad daylight. These were not and could not have been done on the spot. Had they been so, they would not in all probability have expressed so much. They were the result of profound and careful study, the outcome of a most powerful and receptive memory. His conscientiousness is brought home to us more clearly when we examine the little annotated sketches in pencil of complex subjects which he had drawn from nature, and others which realized the most wonderful appreciation of beauty. He spared neither time nor trouble, but strove to express his ideal through the constant and persistent study which is indispensable to the landscape painter. It is interesting to note that in his artistic life his development was based on the careful study of actualities. By the stages of materialism and realism through which he passed, he earned the right to express the ideal. He who will not serve is not fitted to rule, and never was there a case in any life in which this maxim was better verified. This service must be long and tedious for most. For others, less so, perhaps by reason of their innate capacity for grasping essentials. But is it not so in other departments of life? And if beginners could be saved from the inclination to stray from the path that leads to the goal would be sooner reached. End of chapter 13. End of The Art of Landscape Painting in Oil Color by Alfred East. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.